It was a time of stark and sometimes startling contrasts in American life. World War I was over. Women got the right to vote. Fashion took a liberal turn. Alcohol was outlawed. Babe Ruth was king of the ballpark, Charles Lindbergh of the skies. Jazz filled the air and the airwaves, and just about everybody who could afford it went to the movies in the Roaring Twenties. The Roaring Twenties has the reputation as a decade of play and prosperity. Though unemployment was low and many Americans were better off financially, real wealth was concentrated among just a few families. 60% of America's riches were owned by only 2% of the people. The 27,500 wealthiest families had as much money as the 12 million poorest. With the end of World War I, the country desperately wanted to return to normal. But prices shot upward with the increased demand for goods and services, while wages were still low due to a ban on raises and labor strikes during the war. Now that the war had ended, strikes over higher wages resumed. In September 1919, Boston police walked off patrol, citing lousy pay and long hours. Their subsequent absence triggered a free-for-all of looters and vandals. In turn, city officials granted no negotiation. The police force was replaced without the option to return. That same month, 343,000 steel workers staged a nationwide strike, only to taste a violent defeat. When substitute workers were hired, rioting erupted, resulting in the mobilization of federal troops. 18 steel workers lost their lives in the struggle. The walkout lasted 4 months with no reward. As labor unrest spread across the country, some Americans felt it was being fostered by communists, radicals who believed in an economic and social system where prosperity is owned by everyone, and the needs of the whole are more important than those of the individual. Other citizens grew increasingly suspicious of immigrants, fearing they too might be communists. This so-called Red Scare was at a high during the presidential election of 1919, and Ohio Lieutenant Governor Warren G. Harding's campaign promise of a return to normalcy was just what the country wanted to hear and believe.
America's present need is not heroics, but healing. Not nostrums, but normalcy. Not revolution, but restoration.
Handsome, good-natured, and well-spoken, Harding and his running mate Calvin Coolidge of Massachusetts easily defeated the Democratic ticket of James Cox and Franklin D. Roosevelt. Harding's proposal of a return to normalcy meant going back to pre-progressive era policies. He was opposed to the federal government's interference in business affairs and most social reforms. He rejected Woodrow Wilson's plea that America should actively participate in the League of Nations.
We seek no part in directing the destinies of the old world.
Harding's isolationist policy, keeping America out of world affairs, was popular, and his successors, Presidents Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover, followed his lead through the decade. Harding's cabinet was filled with pro-business appointees, including Herbert Hoover, head of the Commerce Committee, Charles Evans Hughes, Secretary of State, and Andrew Mellon, Secretary of the Treasury. In 1923, he presented Congress his Mellon Plan, which on the surface sought a general reduction in income taxes. In fact, the plan cut the top income tax bracket level from 50% to 25%, while only reducing the lowest bracket from 4% to 3. Congressman William P. Connery of Massachusetts was outraged.
When I see a provision in this Mellon tax bill which is going to save Mr. Mellon himself $800,000 on his income tax and his brother $600,000 on his, I cannot give it my support.
Nevertheless, the Mellon Plan passed, as did his proposal to raise tariffs on imported goods to one of the highest levels in history. Americans soon stopped buying foreign-made products, and that made it almost impossible for France and Great Britain to repay their war debts to the United States. Meanwhile, Secretary of Commerce Hoover aggressively helped American businesses recover from the war effort, while Secretary of State Hughes convinced the leading world powers to reduce the size of their navies. Despite these recoveries and Harding's popularity, by the end of his 3rd year, scandal rocked his administration. His old poker buddies from Ohio, whom he'd handed jobs in government, were caught taking bribes. Harding expressed his disappointment.
I have no trouble with my enemies, but my friends, they're the ones that keep me walking the floor nights.
The worst offense of the notorious Ohio gang involved Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall. During the Progressive Era, oil-rich public lands located in Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and Elk Hill, California, were set aside for use by the Navy. Fall transferred control of those lands to his Interior Department, and then secretly leased them to oil companies in exchange for $100,000 in bonds, cattle, and cash. By the summer of 1923, Harding, now saddened, confused, and disillusioned by the betrayal of his friends, left Washington for a goodwill trip to Alaska. Upon his return to San Francisco, he became ill and died on August 2nd. Harding's Vice President Calvin Coolidge assumed office. A simple, honest, and quiet man, he once joked about his subdued demeanor.
I have never been hurt by what I haven't said.
Silent Cal, as Coolidge was nicknamed, was elected president 1 year later, receiving almost 16 million votes, and would have easily won a second term, but unexpectedly decided not to run. With Coolidge at the helm, continuing Harding's pro-business policies, it was boom times for the American economy. Over 40% of the world's wealth belonged to Americans, with 11,000 millionaires living in America by 1926. Low interest rates meant that the construction of plants, homes, and office buildings soared. By the end of the era, construction had begun on the mammoth 102-story Empire State Building. Meanwhile, on the streets below, millions of Americans learned to drive. At the beginning of the Roaring Twenties, there were only 8 million automobiles registered in the U.S. By the end of the decade, more than 23 million. Henry Ford made a bold prediction.
When I'm through, everyone will be able to afford one, and about everyone will have one.
America's new love affair with the car spurred production of rubber, steel, glass, and gasoline. A mobile America wanted new roads, new destinations, and new places to live. The suburbs. Automaking became a major American industry. To meet demand, automakers perfected the assembly line method of manufacturing, and many other industries followed their lead. Scientific management, championed by Frederick Taylor, revolutionized American business by identifying the most time-efficient ways to complete a task and increase production beyond the rate of technology. Farmers adopted modern methods of production, but with an entirely different result. Larger, more efficient farms, utilizing more farm machinery than human laborers, created an overproduction of farm commodities. Many farmers had borrowed money to expand their farms and buy equipment when demand was high during the war. Now, falling prices and income forced many into bankruptcy. Congressmen from farm states unified as the Farm Bloc and proposed price supports and legislation to aid farmers. Repeatedly, President Coolidge vetoed their attempts. Farmers wished that Silent Cal would just remain silent. His remarks brought them little consolation.
Well, farmers have never made much money. I don't believe we can do much about it.
Urban workers were much better off than farmers. Despite a decline in labor union membership, average wages increased by 20%. A more startling increase was in the number of homes with electricity. Between 1913 and 1927, the number grew by 465%. Soon, moderately priced electrical conveniences like vacuum cleaners, washing machines, and refrigerators were found in more and more American households. Chain stores like Sears and J.C. Penney did a brisk business selling ready-made clothes. And grocery cafeterias like Piggly Wiggly, the forerunner of the modern supermarket, offered everything from canned foods to sliced bread. Advertising lured consumers into the stores, and readily available credit using the installment plan made buying easy. Americans suddenly found they had much more time for community and leisure activities. Telephones and later radios became common in most middle-class homes. Mass transit, streetcars, and subways provided mobility for city dwellers, and the airplane was used to move mail from coast to coast. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh flew his airplane from continent to continent. Lucky Lindy's solo 3,614-mile flight across the Atlantic Ocean to Paris ensured his place as America's new hero. 4 million people witnessed Charles Lindbergh's triumphant return to America, showering him with thousands of pounds of ticker tape as he paraded up Broadway. Lindbergh's flight also captured the imagination of the public and stirred their interest in flying.
I look forward to the day when transatlantic flying will be a regular thing.
Soon, the single-engine Lockheed Vega and the Ford Trimotor airplanes were carrying as many as 10 passengers, and already mobile America became even more so. By the end of the Roaring Twenties, 43 airlines were operating in the United States. Despite the economic boom times, the Roaring Twenties was a period of great tension between Americans. Social, racial, and moral beliefs were constantly being challenged. A fear of communism, socialism, and anarchy, fueled by a distrust of any foreigner, led to one of the most notorious convictions and executions in American history. 2 Italian immigrants, shoemaker Nicola Sacco and fishmonger Bartolomeo Vanzetti, were accused of robbing and killing a factory paymaster and a guard. Sacco and Vanzetti admitted to being anarchists, people who want to abolish all forms of government, and to being draft dodgers during World War I. However, both maintained they had not committed the crime. On the basis of circumstantial evidence, Sacco and Vanzetti were convicted and executed. Their guilt or innocence is still debated today. Guilty or not, the case personified the fear Americans had of immigrants. Some paranoid citizens felt immigrants took jobs rightfully belonging to American citizens. Others felt too many immigrants were political radicals. Between 1919 and 1921, the yearly number of new immigrants had shot up from 141,000 to 805,000. And Congress bowed to the pressure of Americans with nativist attitudes by passing a new law limiting immigration into the U.S. Additional restrictions were imposed 3 years later when the National Origins Act of 1924 further limited immigration. The acts discriminated against people from Eastern and Southern Europe, mostly Roman Catholics and Jews, and excluded the immigration of Japanese citizens altogether. The laws did not apply to immigrants from the Western Hemisphere, however, and approximately 1 million Canadians and 500,000 Mexicans crossed the borders into the U.S. The increasing popularity of nativism also stirred the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, whose members had tormented and killed many African Americans in the South after the Civil War. The new Klan extended their bigotry to anyone not American, not Protestant, not white, while attempting to stamp out unions and saloons. By 1924, it boasted a membership of more than 4 million members. The imperial wizard of the KKK summed up the Klan's doctrine succinctly in his 1926 booklet, The Klan's Fight for Americanism, when he revealed the Klan's slogan, Native, White, Protestant, Supremacy. Although the KKK dominated certain state politics at times during the Roaring Twenties, its popularity waned after Indiana Klan chieftain D.C. Steve Stevenson was indicted and jailed for a brutal assault on a female assistant. The resulting scandal and his conviction for second-degree murder signaled the decline of the Klan's political influence, and by the end of the decade, membership had dwindled to only 50,000. While the hateful Ku Klux Klan was growing in popularity, a peaceful separatist movement was gaining a large group of followers, Garveyism. Marcus Garvey, a Jamaican, founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association in 1914. He moved his organization to New York, and by the mid-1920s, there were more than 500,000 members. The association held two central beliefs. The first was that blacks should return to Africa and build a homeland of their own. Garvey had even designed a uniform for himself as the Provisional President of Africa. Second, Garvey insisted his followers should not envy or imitate whites or seek integration. Black is beautiful, he declared, and you are better than white people. Garvey started a successful newspaper and a steamship company to help raise funds for the cause. But the steamship company, the Black Star, failed. He was convicted of mail fraud and sent to prison. Only a handful of his followers actually returned to Africa, but Marcus Garvey's fundamental belief in the dignity and pride deserved by all African Americans certainly lives on. The Roaring Twenties marked the first time in American history when more people lived in cities and towns than in rural areas. Americans moving to cities from small villages had to adapt not only to new and challenging physical living conditions, they encountered a new, more permissive moral environment as well. Two events fittingly demonstrate the clash between traditional moral values of the country and the modern mores of the city: the Scopes trial and Prohibition. In 1925, the state of Tennessee passed a law that outlawed any teaching of English biologist Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, challenged contemporary beliefs about creation and outraged fundamentalist Christians' literal interpretation of the Bible, believing God created the universe in 6 days. John Scopes, a high school biology teacher from Dayton, Tennessee, believed Darwin was right, and despite the state law, taught his students the theory of evolution. As a result, Scopes was charged under the Anti-Evolution Statute and went to trial for the misdemeanor. The American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU, which had been founded during the Red Scare earlier in the decade, hired the most renowned trial lawyer of the day, Clarence Darrow, to defend Scopes. The prosecutor was equally well known: William Jennings Bryan, a 3-time candidate for president, skilled orator, and fundamentalist Christian. The press had a field day and called it the monkey trial, as the big city reporters repeatedly made fun of rural values. Darrow defended his stance.
We have the purpose of preventing bigots and ignoramuses from controlling the education of the United States, and you know it. And that is all.
Although the judge found John Scopes guilty of violating the state's law, Many felt that Clarence Darrow had actually won the case because he had managed to get William Jennings Bryan to admit on the stand that he did not actually believe the Earth was created in 6 24-hour days. The Tennessee Supreme Court later overturned the verdict on a technicality, and Scopes was set free. But the debate over teaching the theory of evolution in schools still continues. Americans with conservative, traditional values succeeded in convincing Congress to prohibit the sale and use of alcohol. But prohibition, the noble experiment as Herbert Hoover dubbed it, simply didn't work. On January 16, 1920, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution was passed, outlawing the manufacture, sale, or transportation of alcoholic beverages. The amendment was supported mainly by rural Americans from the South and Southwest who believed drinking to be a sin. Urban city dwellers generally saw drinking as a natural part of life and the use of alcohol as an individual's decision. Evangelist Billy Sunday spoke for many prohibitionists.
Every man who casts a vote for the saloons deserves that his son shall die a drunkard, or that his daughters should be consigned to the tender mercies of a drunken husband.
Billy Sunday got his wish when prohibition became the law of the land. But prohibition did not stop people from drinking alcohol. Many went to speakeasies, hidden illegal clubs, and drank liquor smuggled in by bootleggers from Canada. Organized crime, which provided illegal booze or hooch, flourished, and prohibition incited more crime, not less. 13 years later, the noble experiment was over. The Roaring Twenties are often called the Jazz Age, a time when new forms of art like jazz emerged with a distinctly American flair. Anti-war literature, like Ernest Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises, found favor with Americans, as did the writing of F. Scott Fitzgerald, whose Great Gatsby depicted the new American dream of wealth and success, while Sinclair Lewis examined the realities of life in small-town America, revealing its greed and lack of culture. On the stage, groundbreaking playwrights like Eugene O'Neill presented dramas that focused on family conflict and isolation in the modern age. Artists such as Georgia O'Keeffe depicted life in urban America in the 20s. Nowhere was America's uniqueness more evident than in her music. From George Gershwin's instant success with Rhapsody in Blue and Concerto in F, to the phenomenal growth of a truly American musical form, jazz. Jazz was born in New Orleans in the early part of the century, a blend of the blues and ragtime. Migrating African Americans brought this new music to the North, a great many settling in the Upper West Side of New York City in an area called Harlem. Harlem became the center not only for jazz, it became the heart of African American creativity during the Harlem Renaissance. From poets like Langston Hughes to performers like Duke Ellington, to songstress Bessie Smith, who sold 1 million recordings of downhearted blues. By 1927, Smith was the highest-paid African American performer in the world. Singer, dancer, comedian Josephine Baker, on the other hand, chose to live and work in Paris, spreading the influence of the Harlem Renaissance even to Europe. Women and men found pleasure and entertainment listening to the radio. And for many, radio became their main source of news about the world. Americans were also leaving their homes to find new entertainment at the movies. By 1925, filmmaking had become the nation's 4th largest industry, and there were more than 20,000 movie houses nationwide, many of them elaborate picture palaces. With the advent of talkies, movie attendance doubled. Women also saw a new image emerge for them in the Roaring Twenties, the flapper. Having finally gotten the right to vote with the passage of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, emancipated women threw out their corsets, high-lace shoes, and dull floor-length dresses. They bobbed their hair and wore short skirts. A woman of the Roaring Twenties also had new choices. She didn't necessarily have to be a housewife anymore. Instead, she could choose whether to marry at all, have children, go to work, or build a career. Marriage became more of a romantic choice. Equality was not prevalent in the workforce, with women usually earning much less than men, even when they perform the same job. Medical schools went so far as to impose strict quotas on the number of women allowed to enter. Americans were also reading. 8 million more Americans were reading newspapers by the mid-20s, many enjoying tabloids and magazines that featured sensational stories about gangsters and entertainers. By the end of the decade, 10 magazines had circulations of more than 2 million. Literacy was on the rise. The number of people attending high school had quadrupled since 1914, and high school was no longer just for college-bound students. Americans also discovered the pleasures of watching professional sports. From baseball's Leroy Satchel Paige to boxing's Manasseh Mauler Jack Dempsey. Entertainment of all kinds became part of the legacy of the Roaring Twenties, as Americans spent over $4.5 billion on entertainment, much of it on pastimes and fads. Some of those fads, like flagpole sitting or dance marathons, seem so silly now. These images of an almost adolescent America, finally free of the fear and drudgery of war, are how most people view the Roaring Twenties. And in fact, it was a brief period of relative prosperity. Unfortunately, despite the outward appearance of stability, the American economy was crumbling, and by late 1929 would be brought to its knees by the start of the Great Depression. But until the stock market crashed, the 20s were indeed roaring.